Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the International Spy Museum. My name is Mark Stout. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm the historian here. And today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. David Crist, who is the author of The Twilight War, The Secret History of America's 30-Year Conflict with Iran, which is just out, I believe, 2 weeks ago from the Penguin Press. Dr. Crist received his bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and went on to get a doctorate in Middle Eastern history from Florida State. And he is currently a senior historian with the federal government and is also an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. He has served in the past as an intelligence officer with the Marines, and he saw firsthand the war against al-Qaeda and also the confrontation with Iran. I don't know if we'll get any personal stories or not today, but those might be worth asking at the signing afterwards. He did serve in the first Gulf War and spent 2 tours with Special Operations Forces both in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was, in fact, part of the very first U.S. military forces inside Afghanistan, and in 2003, he actually personally witnessed some of the confrontations between American and Iranian forces off the Iraqi coast in a very tense incident, one of the tensest incidents between the two countries in many, many years. He's a Middle East scholar, recognized expert on Iran in particular and defense issues, frequently advises senior government officials in general and particularly in the U.S. military, including several commanders of United States Central Command, the command that encompasses such garden spots and hot spots as Iran, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf, as the U.S. government likes to call it. I think that's actually an interesting commentary in and of itself on U.S.-Iranian relations, and Afghanistan. I would say after the Israel-Palestine problem, the confrontation with Iran is probably America's longest-running security nightmare in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein was a problem for a long time. But it was really only about 15 years or so. The instability in Iraq is less than 10 years old at this point, and appears to be, if you take the long view, God willing, improving. The war in Afghanistan is only 11 years old. Iran, by contrast, has been a nightmare for us for, if I'm doing my arithmetic correctly, 33 years this year and counting. And arguably, there's no end in sight, and many people believe that things are getting worse as we approach potentially a nuclear crisis. So Dr. Crist's book is an excellent recounting of the confrontation with Iran and how it's played out over the last third of a century in military action by the U.S. military, back-channel diplomacy, frustrated more often than not, and also in covert and clandestine operations by America's intelligence agencies. All the elements of America's national power come together, sometimes working together well, sometimes maybe not so well, in the Iran problem. So I think we have much to learn, and I'm sure we'll have a fascinating talk. So without further ado, Dr. David Crist.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It gives me a chance to focus on, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of this book. At least it was for me personally, uncovering it, and one that doesn't always get a lot of play and different audiences. And since this is the Spy Museum, of course, it focuses on spies. There's always a little danger. My professor, way back many years ago when I started the doctorate process, advised me that if you're going to write a book, make sure that the subject is about something where all the participants are dead. Unfortunately, this is not the case here, so you never know who you meet in the audience. In many cases, they're the primary sources themselves. So, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William Crowe, read the top-secret CIA memo, he immediately realized the magnitude of the crisis. The United States verged on the brink of war in the Middle East. Iran plans to conduct a massive naval attack on Saudi Arabia with the objective of crippling their oil production, the report stated bluntly. Over the past month, American intelligence had reported an unusual congregation of small boats manned by fanatical or fervent Revolutionary Guard sailors in the northern Persian Gulf. And recent satellite images confirmed the boats being moved by truck from southern Iran up to the port of Bushehr. But Iran's attentions had eluded the Pentagon. However, this new report described in detail the number of Iranian boats, their target Saudi Arabia, and even predicted the time for attack within 72 hours. Crowe held the outline of Tehran's entire war plan. "How good's your source for this?" he asked the CIA courier. "He's a recent recruit, a Navy captain well placed within the Iranian military," the officer replied. That afternoon, Crowell met with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to Washington. "We have a tip-off of an impending attack on your facilities," Crowell told the prince. "We'll need to give them a warm welcome." On September 30th, 1987, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, 33-year-old Mohsen Rezai, arrived in the Persian Gulf port of Bushehr to personally direct the attack on Saudi Arabia. The truculent former electrical engineer had long advocated a strike on Saudi Arabia or American forces, and after the killing of 275 Iranian demonstrators in Mecca 2 months earlier by the kingdom's security forces, Ayatollah Khomeini finally agreed with Rezai. The supreme leader approved a massive attack on Saudi Arabia offshore oil rigs under the appropriate name, Operation Hajj. The Iranian military quietly amassed dozens of small boats and one missile boat in the Gulf. As the day of the attack approached, senior officers in Tehran arrived to witness the operation, establishing a headquarters in an old dormitory building next to the jetty at Bushehr. However, the United States was waiting. Just as the attack progressed, 3 small jelly bean-shaped American Special Operations helicopters discovered the vanguard of the Iranian small boats, and a hail of machine gun and rocket fire sank all 3 boats and killed 7 Iranian sailors. The ferocity and precision of the American attack stunned the Guard, and the Iranian admirals ordered a hasty retreat. Rezai and other Iranian officials immediately suspected somebody had tipped off the Americans. They had a traitor in their midst. William Casey was 68 when Ronald Reagan appointed him to run the American spy organization. The director of Central Intelligence did not radiate a James Bond aura. He shuffled more than walked, bald with pronounced jowls. He muffled at times to a point of incoherence, a trait that seemed to worsen when he testified before Congress. But despite the visible aging, Casey retained a keen mind, and he was a voracious reader and astute student of history. He viewed the world through the lens of the Cold War, and Casey did not see the Islamic Republic as an intrinsic threat. The Iranian Revolution had been significant, he believed, because it eliminated America's chief defender of the Persian Gulf from Soviet expansion. And the key, Casey believed, was to find a way to bring Iran back into the Western fold of the Cold War. When Casey assumed the CIA directorship, the American espionage effort in Iran was in a shambles. CIA station in Tehran had been one of the largest in the world during the Shah's regime, but had been largely focused outside of Iran, not internally. When Iranian protesters accused the American embassy of being a den of spies, a senior White House staffer wrote to Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, "It's supremely ironic that we should stand accused of so much espionage out of our embassy in Tehran when we've actually done so little." Casey came to office determined to reinvigorate the spying effort in Tehran. It was one of the most strategically important countries in the Middle East, yet the CIA knew next to nothing about what was happening inside the country. If the Iranian government was leaning towards Moscow, Casey wanted to know about it and position American agents there in hopes of drawing them back to the United States. In early 1981, Reagan signed off on the first of 2 presidential findings, essentially an authorization for covert action required by law, approving renewed efforts to build a spy network in Iran. CIA established a new office to run the Iranian operations inside one wing of the 9-story IG Farben building in Frankfurt, Germany. This 1930 structure housed the Army 5th Corps and also the Army's own clandestine operations directed against the Soviet Union. Langley called this new unit Tefron, a hybrid name of Tehran and Frankfurt, and began the painstaking process of recruiting agents. As Turkey did not require a visa for its citizens, it served as a corridor for those trying to escape the repression of the Ayatollahs. Ankara and Istanbul swelled with Persian expatriates looking to obtain visas to travel to the U.S. or Europe. And Turkey took center stage in the spy contest between Washington and Iran, as the grounds around the American embassy in Ankara became a favorite recruiting locale for American intelligence officers. Captain Taraji Riyahi never intended to be a spy for Washington. At 40, he lived comfortably in a nice house in the suburbs of Tehran with his childhood sweetheart. He had a son and a self-assured 8-year-old precocious girl upon whom he doted, often rising early to make breakfast. He was no lover of the new Islamic republic. He made wine in his own basement. He liked to play cards and enjoy life. And he had repeatedly distinguished himself in combat against the Iraqis and was rewarded with a plum assignment in naval headquarters in Tehran. As deputy plans officer, he served as number 2 man for devising Iranian naval attacks in the never-ending war with Iraq. In the winter of 1985, Captain Raihe traveled to Ankara, Turkey, seeking a visa for his own son to go live with an aunt in Hawaii. He wished to save his son from becoming yet one more martyr at the gates of Basra, lost in the killing fields of southern Iraq. A few days later, he met with an American embassy employee who introduced himself only by the name of Parker. Pleasant and nondescript, Parker offered to cut through all the red tape of getting the visa. He said it could be done quickly through the West German embassy. In return, though, Parker wanted information on the Iranian military. Captain Raihe agreed to the terms, underwent a standard lie detector test to ensure he was not a double agent for the Iranian intelligence. While his son's visa was arranged, Captain Raihe officially became a U.S. intelligence agent, or as the Iranian commentators later said it, one of those who sold their faith and honor for the CIA's deceptive glamour. He was one of about 5 naval officers the agency recruited, as well as Army officers, Navy officers. Langley successfully enlisted a diverse group of civilians as well, including a lawyer in the Iranian Foreign Ministry, local government officials, even an engineer employed at a chemical factory, all with access to the broad range of information needed by American intelligence. Relaying messages to these recruits proved difficult. Iran's a denied country. There's no U.S. embassy there. CIA smuggled in radios to allow the Iranian agents to receive Morse-coded messages that came across shortwave airwaves as blocks of numbers. A separate provided paper cipher translated these numbers into individual letters. But communication with their agents came more from the 19th century than the 20th century, and through the means of more or less invisible ink. Using specially treated pens and paper that came to life under the proper solution, the agents would write on seemingly innocuous letters to fictional friends in Frankfurt the details of their reports in between the lines or on the back of the page, and an agent on the other side would bring these messages to life using a special solution. Hundreds of these letters traveled back and forth between Germany and Iran. One Air Force officer later admitted to sending 110 letters himself back to Tehran. Casey had another client, though, dealing with Iran, and that was the U.S. Department of Defense. In the summer of 1981, the Pentagon revised its plans to respond to a Soviet invasion of Iran, or to counter a possible communist coup. A key element of the Pentagon's new scheme would involve deploying clandestine special forces teams to organize a guerrilla army and conduct sabotage behind the Soviet lines. And the military needed the agency to develop a network inside Iran, as legally they were the only ones with the authority to do so during peacetime. Langley would build a covert paramilitary network that would serve as a foundation upon which the special forces could fly in on top of. And the CIA needed to recruit Iranian agents who could greet American parachutists in the middle of the night, provide information on roads and bridges, establish mustering station, and these sorts of things, rescue downed pilots. To manage this new effort, the CIA created an organization given the nonsensical cover name BQ Tug underneath the Tehran operation in Frankfurt. And they worked closely with a small cadre of military officers at U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida. And BQ Tug quickly achieved some success. It recruited more than half a dozen teams, including Iranian military personnel, even civilians stationed mostly around Iranian Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran and astride the border with the Soviet Union, and the most likely avenue the U.S. thought the Soviets would invade. Some of these Iranian agents' only responsibility was just to keep watching Soviet forces on the other side of the border. All this time, agents of Iranian's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, MOIS, were not idle. From the days of the Shah and Savak, the Iranians excelled at counterintelligence. The new Iranian intelligence service had been formed in August of 1984 out of several other smaller intelligence groups that sprang up after the revolution. And surprisingly, considering the hatred for Khomeini's backers had for the Shah's secret police, the MLIS employed a large number of former Savak officers. Perhaps one-third of those working for the MLIS had worked for the Shah, and they proved equally as formidable in addressing the security threats to the Islamic Republic as they had to the royal regime. In July 1985, Iran struck the first blow at the U.S. spy effort. The MLIS learned of an American spy ring when the CIA tried to recruit a mid-level officer in Azerbaijan for this BQ tug effort. Unfortunately, they approached the wrong guy, and rather than cooperate, he immediately alerted the MLIS to the U.S. recruitment drive. And at this point, things started to unravel for the United States. All communications with Iranian agents, including BQ tug, were handled through just a few post office boxes in Frankfurt, Germany. Compounding this era, a single clerk at Tehran pinned every letter written to all the U.S. agents in Iran. Each letter was mailed from the same few post office boxes in Frankfurt and written in the same hand with the same return addresses. Alerted by the failed recruitment of the mid-level officer of BQ tug, Iranian agents employed countless workers to painstakingly screen all incoming mail from Germany. And they couldn't possibly have overlooked this unusual cluster of letters to Frankfurt, some destined to suspects in this BQ tug effort, all written in the same hand. In 1987, Iranian officials arrested 2 CIA agents in the foreign ministry, capturing the radios in the CIA-supplied code books. The agency soon learned of the security breach and changed the codes, but it was too late, and Iran was already on to their entire network. As a Navy Deputy Plans Officer, Captain Raihe began working with his Revolutionary Guard counterparts on this Hodge plan, designed to conduct a punishing attack on the Saudi oil fields. When Iran began amassing dozens of small boats in Bushehr, the CIA turned to Captain Raihe for answers. And he promptly provided Langley with the details of the plan, including the intended target and the time of the attack. After U.S. Special Forces helicopters descended on this armada in October of 1987, the Iranian officials, as I said, started looking for who might have been the spy or their traitor in their midst. And not surprisingly, the MLIS focused on those receiving letters from Frankfurt, including Captain Raihe. The MLIS was nothing but patient, and over the next few years, they painstakingly unraveled all the different tentacles of our effort. And in September 1988, they struck. Former BQ tug agents were easiest to track down. Many were simple peasants, and a visit to a dark holding cell with a menacing interrogator was enough to give up the rest of their comrades. When one talked, they would quickly roll up the entire team. When coercion failed, they would be pinned to cots and beaten on the soles of their feet with wire rods. In months of solitary confinement in dark cells, with waterboardings and electric shocks, loosened the tongues of those who continued to withhold information. In February 1989, Captain Raihe's 8-year-old daughter bounded home from school. She put in her favorite video, Cinderella, only to discover the VCR was broken, which caused an emotional output by this rather spoiled little 8-year-old girl. Mother arrived home from shopping and tried to console her, and about that time, 4 men arrived at the front door. Serious and unsmiling, they demanded entry and began methodically searching the house, while the captain's wife and daughter waited nervously in the living room. A couple of hours later, Captain Raihe arrived from home, tired after an hour-long bus commute from his office. 2 security officers greeted him coldly and ordered him to accompany them. As his wife began to cry, he gave his daughter a kiss and quick goodbye before being placed in the back seat of an unmarked car and whisked away. Iran finally went public about the spy network on April 21st, 1989. When Hashemi Rafsanjani, then Speaker of the Iranian Parliament and future President, announced at Friday prayers that several dens of espionage had been uncovered. He was repeatedly interrupted by a large crowd chanting, "American spies must be executed." God's decree will be carried out, Rafsanjani responded. A month later, in May 1989, Iranian state TV began a 4-part miniseries about the CIA spy ring entitled Top Secret. Part documentary and part propaganda, the docudrama included tantalizing details about the long history of CIA meddling in the country and attracted large audiences. The show included interviews with those arrested who described their training and even the use of the invisible ink. The series repeatedly warned Iranians not to fall for the CIA's lies. The only promises the spies and intelligence organizations and their agents are to be realized are betrayal of self, treachery against homeland, regret, and sorrow, the announcer would caution. But for Taraji Riahi's wife and family, this was not a TV show, but a very real unfolding tragedy. His captors kept him in an isolated cell at notorious Evin prison. He was tried before a military special tribunal, the proceedings videotaped. Standing in the docket, he repeatedly denied being unfaithful to his country. I remain loyal to Iran, he said, implying that the current Islamist government was not. And not surprisingly, his confession did not air on Iranian TV. In early November, Iran prepared to mark the 10th anniversary of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy. The government planned a massive demonstration in front of the former U.S. Embassy. Loudspeakers serenaded visitors with the confessions of the recently captured American spies. That evening, Captain Raihe was allowed to briefly speak with his wife, and he explained that he's being moved to another cell, usually an ominous sign. The next day, Raihe's jailers allowed him one last call to his family, where he spoke to a younger cousin as neither his wife or daughter were home. It would be the last anyone ever heard from Captain Taraji Riahi. The Iranian government used the anniversary of the seizure of the embassy to send a clear signal to Washington about the fate of its spies. Raihe and 3 other naval officers were escorted to the gallows of Evin prison, and the next day the family learned of his fate when Iranian television announced their executions. Over the next year, Iranian authorities claimed to have executed more than 50 men, including some convicted for spying for Iraq and Israel. A number of the BQ tug agents who had more menial roles in the CIA paramilitary scheme were given minimal prison terms or allowed to serve out their sentences in internal isolation, internal exile. The incident had a significant effect on Iran, and since the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, Iranian officials have been sensitive to CIA mischief in their country. Uncovering the ring only confirmed their worst fears about American intentions. The fact that the BQ tug effort was a paramilitary plan aimed at the Soviets was lost on the Iranians, who perhaps naturally assumed it had been part of a larger scheme to overthrow the Islamic Republic. For the CIA, it would be one of the worst disasters in the agency's history. The end of the decade found the CIA much in the same position had been at the beginning in Iran, with an intelligence network in tatters. Casey's ambitions of bringing back to Iran into the Western fold were gone. And for Captain Raihe and 20 other agents, it required the ultimate sacrifice to help the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for questions here. So I see Bruce already with an itchy trigger finger. So if you just wait for the microphone to come, we're recording this for our podcast.
Thank you very much. You described this wide range of U.S. agents, CIA agents functioning there. They appear largely to be military. How well was the CIA doing in other categories, such as technology and especially political?
Political was one of the great failings. One of the objectives Casey always had for access, I suppose, was to get senior political people in the government. The whole objective was to find people not only who would provide us information about what they're debating, but also a guy who might be pro-American we could work with. And they never really had great success there. Technology was not so significant. Well, actually, I'll take that back. Technology was significant. We had pretty good sources with the Iranians when they were making their mines. Iran started an indigenous naval mine production facility, and the U.S. had pretty good information on that. One of the military officers was the guy who negotiated the arrangement with China to provide anti-ship cruise missiles to Iran. So obviously, if you got the guy who negotiated it on your payroll, it certainly gives you pretty interesting insights. But as far as the politics was always sort of a failure.
Gentleman right here. Gentleman in the front row.
My name is Munzir Sulaiman with Al Mayadeen TV. I'm originally from Lebanon. Your book, critical of the experience in Lebanon, whether the Israeli experience or United States experience, and you were very critical of President Reagan handling of the situation after the killing, the attack on the barracks of the Marines. At the same time, you mentioned something probably can be a sort of revenge, the kind of the phalange, they were recruited to bomb Fadlallah. Can you shed some lights on this experience as a whole, please?
Yeah, I think Lebanon's probably, I'm a little kinder on Reagan, believe it or not, on the Iran arms sale than I think most people probably are. Lebanon, I think, was a mistake in a lot of ways. As background, Ariel Sharon had sort of a grand design where he would, with one massive sweep Israeli armor, would get rid of the PLO, knock the Syrians out of Lebanon, and he had a secret deal done with Bashir Gemayel, who was head of the Christian Phalange, who would be the Lebanese president, and they would establish a relationship sort of between the Phalange and the Israelis. And they sort of deceive Reagan on this, on a number of points. Anyway, the Israelis launched the assault, and the U.S. ends up intervening after the death of Bashir Gemayel and the massacres at Shatil and Sabra, two Palestinian camps. The problem I really had with the United States was, one is, a couple folds. One is, we essentially fall back on what the Israelis had originally intended, which is backing the Gemayel, now his younger, less capable brother, as the legitimate government of Lebanon, which immediately put the U.S. at odds with the other parties of Iran's civil war. And the other problem is the U.S. was looking at Lebanon through the lens of the Cold War, as if the Syrians were really a Soviet proxy, and if somehow we lose in Lebanon, we lose part of a fight to the larger Cold War. In reality, the dynamics in Lebanon weren't part of that thing. So the U.S. goes in there, I think, very naive into Lebanon. The other issue that happens is the Marines who are around the Beirut airport are there as peacekeepers, part of an effort to try to, after Shatil and Sabra, to try to prop up what is pretty much a Christian-dominated government, but at least the intention was to try to establish a better order in Lebanon and get both the Israelis and the Syrians out. But the U.S. policy starts drifting more actively into the civil war as the Lebanese army and even some of the Christian Phalange elements start losing in their fights with the Druze and the Shia militia and whoever else they're fighting. The U.S. becomes increasingly a player in this, to the point we actually start providing a military support. At some point, we actually do naval bombardment in support of General Aoun's forces, who was one of the Christian, still is one of the Christian leaders. The problem is that whole policy gets slippery, and the Iranians sort of take advantage of it. See vulnerability in the Americans. They have a list of grievances against the Americans, chiefly support for Iraq at the time. And the thing I've always found interesting in the Iranians is they don't feel a need to retaliate in the same time and space as what the U.S. does. So if the U.S. and the French are supporting Saddam Hussein in their war, what makes these peacekeepers in Lebanon off the table for a reprisal attack? So essentially that's what happened. And then Reagan gets in this huge debate within his administration over what to do as a response. And you raise a great point, I think, which is some of the calculations against the strikes is it just seemed it was for revenge, not to achieve anything. That was Weinberger's argument at the time. On the other hand, the intelligence was pretty convincing on who had been behind the bombing and where they were. And these two competing views fight it out, and ultimately Reagan doesn't make a decision. And so there is no response militarily for it.
If I can assert the prerogative of
Sure.
the chair and ask a question myself, I've seen it suggested that after September 11th, the United States government really missed an opportunity to engage with Iran, covertly, clandestinely, back channel, however you want to characterize it, not publicly, but really engage with Iran over some shared interests that they really felt both governments felt deeply about, i.e. that they didn't like the Taliban. I was wondering if you could comment on, whether you believe that's true or not, and if so, sort of what was the paddling below the water that most of us didn't see publicly?
Well, we've had, in my view, two really serious talks with the Iranians, with Revolutionary Guard officers with good connections to the Supreme Leader, which is what you need. One was during the Iranian arms sale piece to it, and the other one was after 9/11. After 9/11, the Iranians, through some UN talks that were going on in Geneva, reach out to the United States and essentially say, we don't much care for the Taliban either. They had nearly gone to war in 1998 with the Taliban over the killing of Iranian diplomats. Iran was a little nervous that this huge giant was now wounded and the club might head in their direction, so they had a reason to perhaps try to work with the United States. And I think some of the Iranians, particularly the Revolutionary Guard generals that we talked with, did see an overlap of interests in the Taliban. Iranians offered one of the early meetings with Ryan Crocker, who was Ambassador Crocker, who was heading the meetings at the time, to use one of their ports to resupply our effort in Afghanistan. So there was a lot of overlap, a lot of discussion, and I think it was pretty candid. But there was also a lot of backlash against these talks within the George W. Bush White House, and particularly within Secretary Rumsfeld's office and OSD. And a lot of it was a fundamental view that any talk that ultimately it's the regime is our problem, and that any negotiations, no matter what the level, added credibility to the Islamic regime and undermined our efforts, as one memo specifically stated, to delegitimize the regime. So essentially, talking was counterproductive to our long-term goals of isolating Iran. And so, and the problem is you have a real fight within the administration. And ultimately that first term there is no resolution. And a lot of those talks come to an end when President Bush gives us access of evil speech, which the Iranians take as just an absolute snub and insult to these private talks. And they respond by stopping the talks, releasing a guy named Hekmatar, who's a pretty nasty fellow in Afghanistan that they had in custody, who's now a pain in our side, and a lot of other things. So whether this would have led to some great rapprochement between the two nations, I don't know. But I generally do believe that any time you can engage your adversary, it's usually to your benefit. And I think this was perhaps a lost opportunity.
Gentleman right here.
Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. I want to bring it up, your Iran observations up to today. What are Iran's intent and capabilities to disrupt traffic in the Strait of Hormuz? We hear this, it's been over the last 2 years, they've been articulated. Over the last, since the Twilight War, how much improvement has they made in capabilities, and has their intent sharpened to actually use those tools?
Well, as I describe in my book, one of the first military plans that we ever discovered from the Iranians that we captured was a plan called the Goddard Plan to mine the Strait of Hormuz. This is in the mid-1980s. So it's been on their mind for a long time. Today, Iran has thousands of mines, influence mines, old contact mines. They have an awful lot of sophisticated, they have the capability to do that. They have a lot of surface cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles. They have a lot of capability. So, I'll fall back on what was said in open testimony a few months ago. They have the capability to certainly disrupt or shut it down for a short period of time. That's provided, of course, that there's no international effort to stop it from the very beginning, which I think there would be. I've always viewed the Iranians see that sort of as their option of last resort. If all else fails, if there's a blockade, at least that's the way they've traditionally viewed it, is that it's, if they can't export the oil, that would be their last resort. But to answer your question, they have the capability, at least for a short time, I think.
Other questions? Yeah, right here. Hold, if you could wait for the microphone. Hold on, we're recording.
Does the Iranian regime have any long-term goals, or are they basically opportunistic?
I think the Iranian regime has, I mean, I think they're governed by a different set of national interests than we are. I think they're the idea of, I think Henry Kissinger once said they're not a nation, they're a cause. And I think the revolution, the need to somehow be the protector of the downtrodden Shia across the region, I think these figure into their foreign policy calculations. I think they're deeply distrustful of the U.S. motives. I think in many ways they reject the whole concept of American hegemony in the Middle East. I think the Iranians just are, I think they just are approaching the world entirely different from the way that we want. And it's one from their perspective, I think there's a rationality to it. I don't think it's an irrational behavior. It just runs in many ways counter to American interests.
Right here in front again. Oh, and then we'll get the gentleman over here.
Thank you. Can you shed some light about Khatami period, whether there was a missed opportunity between the United States and Khatami, who came as a moderate, and why it failed, that approachment?
Yeah, and the short answer is yes, I do think it was a missed opportunity. You know, in my book, I recount efforts you raised on where the U.S. missed the opportunity. This is one where I think the Iranians missed the opportunity. And I think President Khatami, who's elected in 1997, he comes in at a time of a year after the bombing of Khobar Towers that the U.S. Blames on Iran. It's a period of very heightened tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Whether there would have been a war for a response or not is unclear, but it certainly, the Clinton administration was thinking along those lines, at least planning for it. Khatami comes in and he seems to be an absolute breath of fresh air. He is a moderate, as you said. He makes, one of his early things is makes outreach to the United States, where there's an interesting message sent back through the Omanis, where Khatami essentially says, we had nothing to do with Khobar Towers, but it won't happen again. And so Clinton shifts his gears and I think makes a concerted effort through a whole series of ways between him and Secretary Madeleine Albright to try to reach out to the Iranians and tries to seize this moment around 1999, 2000. And it kind of culminates in a really odd potential meeting at the United Nations during the UN General Assembly meeting, where Clinton, after giving it, both Clinton and President Khatami gave a speech, Clinton kind of loiters around the anteroom hoping or trying to get Khatami to come out so they could meet, shake hands, and hopefully it might be sort of an icebreaker between the two. And what's unclear to me is whether Khatami wanted to do that or his handlers didn't want it, or Khatami got nervous that maybe the Supreme Leader wasn't on board with this opening. And what happens is Khatami ends up leaving by a different door. And so this chance meeting ends. And ultimately, of course, Clinton leaves and nothing happens, and September 11th changes the dynamics. To me, it was a missed opportunity by Iran.
I think there was a gentleman here, and then we'll keep you running, and then we'll go back all the way over there.
Hi, I'm not sure if it's within the scope of your book, but could you talk a little about Stutz and Flame and talk about whether the United States maybe received any inside assistance in pulling off these operations?
Yeah, I really can't comment much on either one of those. Frankly, what I know about Stutz Nexus is what I read in David Sanger's book. So, does it seem to fit into a pattern of this sort of low-level quasi-war? It does. Whether that report is accurate, I don't have any insight.
Okay, and up here, Laura's getting her exercise today.
Yes, I am. What was precisely the degree of Iranian involvement in the Khobar Towers bombing?
Well, what I think I have a whole chapter on this book, in the book. The U.S. If you remember, in 1995, there's an election, and the new Republican Congress comes to power. there's one of the things that new Congress does is push through a $18 million plus up of the CIA's covert budget for Iran, and it's done in a very public way on the front page of the Washington Post, very deliberately. And it's really for domestic political reasons, to tweak, I think, Clinton's nose a little bit. Iran doesn't see it that way. Iran's ability to misinterpret what's going on in the United States is legendary, and vice versa. And so they see this as a de facto covert act of war. So their response is a very traditional Iranian way of doing business, which is through the invisible hand, as they call it, through terrorism, through indirect attacks. Khobar Towers had been identified at least a year earlier. Iran does contingency planning, for probably a better word. They identify targets that seem like easy places to blow up, that have an affiliation to the U.S. or the Israelis or whoever their enemy of the day is. And Khobar Towers was one of those. And they have a network within Saudi Arabia, Saudi Hezbollah, Al-Mughassil, I believe is the gentleman's name who was running it. And it fits in the way the Iranians like to do business, which is using surrogates who are reliable, and also it gives them, again, plausible deniability. I mean, it's tough to trace it back to Iran if it's a Lebanese who executes it. But the evidence I thought was quite convincing that of Iranian working with Lebanese Hezbollah, meetings in Damascus to try to coordinate this attack. Even the final bomb was actually made by a Lebanese Hezbollah who was brought in, who was sort of a bomb-making expert to make sure that this thing didn't go awry, and they ended up blowing themselves up. So to me, it was quite clear. The problem is it took a long time to unravel this. It took several years for the U.S. could really put all the pieces together. And by that time, Khatami is elected. So Clinton's faced with this dilemma: do we respond for Khobar Towers, or do we seize this potential opening?
I think we've got time for one or two. We'll take here.
Thank you very much. Could you comment on the Mahdi in the context of the kind of apocalyptic vision? Are you at all concerned that the Iranians may detonate nuclear weapons to bring in back the Mahdi?
Do you want to explain briefly what the Mahdi is, and then answer the question?
Yeah, the Mahdi, the hidden imam, the 12th imam who disappeared back, the 7th century or so, and you probably know more than I. It's sort of their, at the end of days, he's going to come back and redeem all the downtrodden. Sort of a key tenet of Shiism. I'm less concerned about that. I don't really think the Iranians are. I think the Iranians' prime objective is preserving the revolution. I think that's their single foreign policy focus. So I'm less concerned about that, about them trying to bring the entire world down in this vision of a fire. Having said that, I'm not real comfortable with the idea with the Iranians with a nuclear weapon. I think it changes the dynamics out there. I think it could potentially embolden the Iranians to do more covert attacks and things like this, simply because they know the regime's not going to be threatened. That, I think, is a much greater concern.
Okay, last question. We started with Bruce. We'll end with Bruce.
Bruce Van Voorst. Can you update us on the internal dynamics of the current political situation there? Is Ahmadinejad really the top man, the big man on campus? How does he relate to some of these other leaders around? What about the guards? What about the Bizarri still a factor?
Gosh, if I could answer that question with fidelity, I would be the smartest guy in the U.S. government, because the internal dynamics of the Iranian government are just an enigma to the U.S. We don't have a great understanding of it, nor have we ever. It's factionalized. There's different competing interests. It was by design a diffused government with different centers of power. It's tough. I think there has been a bit of a change since June of 2009, which was the Iranian elections. I think I hate to call guys like Mousavi a moderate, because in our terms he's not, but was always a little bit more pragmatic wing, is perhaps a better way of saying it. And a lot of these guys, Ambassador Zarif, who was their UN ambassador here, people who have a lot of experience dealing with the West, actually do a very good job representing Iran's case in many ways. A lot of them have been sidelined. A lot of them are backers against Ahmadinejad, so they're, and I think since then you've seen a tightening circle, primarily headed by the Revolutionary Guard around the supreme leader, which I think is potentially a disturbing trend because groupthink sits in, you don't have competing views. Ahmadinejad is not really one of those. His power base is the Revolutionary Guard, just like the supreme leader's is. But, you know, the Iranian presidents have always been a thorn in the side of the supreme leader. Khatami was, Rafsanjani was. It's why there's been discussion, at least, of abolishing the whole position, perhaps, because they can be difficult. In other words, they get in power and then sort of they have their own agenda. And that has been Ahmadinejad with the supreme leader. They're not in sync at all. And frankly, I think the supreme leader clearly has the upper hand. I think Ahmadinejad, at least internally, well, he's term limited anyway, but I think his influence is perhaps not as great as it was in his first term.
Let's all thank Dr. David Crist.
Thank you.